Hi, my name is Victoria Gregg, correspondent for Central Africa TV. Today we're interviewing Dr. Monde. She is the director for the Africa program at the Wilson Center. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.
You grew up in Zambia. So the first question I would like to know is, can you share with us some special moments and how it prepared you for this career?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me on the interview. I have very fond memories of growing up in Zambia, and I think it did a fantastic job of preparing me for my career. First and foremost, I think just to give you a little bit of background, I was born the year before Zambia gained its independence from Britain in 1964. And so I was born at one of the most hopeful times. Africans were coming into political power, defining their own futures, and I've been a tremendous beneficiary of that hope that the continent had. And so some of the things that really, I think, helped transform and form me happened in my early years in Zambia. One is my family was very big on education. It's one thing that everybody said no one can take away from you, and if you have it, you can do whatever you want. I come from a large family, 11 kids, and all 11 of us have a college degree, in part because my parents were just so keen on everybody getting an education. I think the second thing was I grew up watching the news. We watched the news as a family, and we discussed the news. And I can remember this as far back as when I was about 7 years old. And I think that piqued my interest in international affairs, just looking at how Africa was connected with the rest of the world. And so I followed that path, and it has really defined my career.
Can you tell our audience about your experience working at the National Summit on Africa and share with us the challenges you may have had?
The National Summit on Africa was my first job in Washington. When I moved from England in 1995, I ended up in New Mexico where my husband was teaching, but I really wanted to work in the Africa space. I felt very strongly that this is a continent that had given me so much and that it was now time for me to give back. I recall along the way that it wasn't just my parents encouraging me to get an education. It was also the villagers in my parents' communities. Both my parents were teachers, and they were very, very supportive of my opportunity and the opportunity of other young people around us to get an education. Now, remember, many of these people had not been to school themselves. They didn't have that opportunity during the colonial period. And so when they supported me, I really felt that when I got that opportunity, I should figure out how to give back to this continent. And so when the job opened up at the National Summit on Africa, in many ways I felt that that was a job that was made for me. The National Summit on Africa was established to educate Americans about Africa and to develop mutually beneficial relations between the United States and Africa, but also to grow the constituency and stakeholder for Africa within the United States. It's one of those regions that doesn't get enough attention in terms of the broader policy framework. Usually when people think about Africa, they think about just the challenges. Like the negativity that defines Africa in the minds of so many people actually overshadows some of the opportunities that exist. So I jumped on that, the opportunity to be able to showcase a continent, both the challenges and the opportunities, and to help define stronger, better, healthier, mutually beneficial relations between the United States and Africa. So it was a challenge in many ways because, again, Africa doesn't get that much attention. So where do you start from strategically positioning that dialogue and the debate about why Africa matters to the United States? So we did a lot of that work, starting with the fact that 12 to 13% of Americans have African roots. There's a connection in and of itself. It's historical. Looking at all the different economic relations that exist between Africa and the United States and how we can build on those. Looking at how we can build capacities for Africans to better address some of their challenges, how we can work together with them. And so for me, that spoke volumes, that this is a mission that's worthy of my being a part of it, and I wanted to contribute to that dialogue and that debate. We started off very small. But after 8 summits, we did 8 national Summit on Africa summits across the country. We really built a strong constituency. By the time we got to Washington for the national summit, we had 10,000 people across the United States participate in our forums and dialogues and educational programs. We had 8,000 people turn up in Washington to come and participate in the national summit to build a plan for action of how the United States could better engage with Africa. So it was challenging, but also very, very fulfilling. And I've stayed in that Africa space all of these years, and I can honestly say that I've seen more engagement between the United States and Africa. I have seen a much stronger understanding of Africa as a continent. It's many different countries. We still have a long way to go, but it's definitely improving. I think there's more of a willingness to look at the opportunities as well as the challenges.
You also served as an advisory council member for the Mo Ibrahim Foundation. What was that experience like?
It was a fantastic experience. I was actually on the advisory council of the Mo Ibrahim Index for Governance, which is a part of the foundation, but a very specific program within that. It was an honor, it was a privilege, and I was very supportive of this effort. As I mentioned earlier, I was born on the cusp of African independence. And so prior to my birth, others had always defined Africa's future. Others had always made the decisions that really impacted Africa's trajectory. And so for me to see Mo Ibrahim, who is of Sudanese birth, an African, giving back to the continent, putting his money in an area that would have a huge transformative change in Africa was really, really important to me, to support this African man who was investing back in the continent and trying to move the continent on the positive trajectory. So what it was all about was it was an index of measuring how well African leaders were providing and governing their countries. That's a powerful message to come from an African. Yes. And it was an objective assessment. And so I really felt that this is something that was worthy of our support to showcase what one African could do in terms of supporting that positive change and transformation on the African continent. And it was especially important for me because I've always maintained that Africa suffers from a leadership deficit. So here is somebody of African descent who was trying to do something positive and objective to help focus that and to help bring about that positive change. So it was an honor. And I'm so grateful to have been a part of that. And I'm glad to see that the Mo Ibrahim Foundation continues to do really good work in the governance space. And I'd encourage as many Africans as possible and others to support the work that they're trying to do with regard to setting a very high bar for governance, a high bar for democratic standards, for respecting human rights as a way of encouraging development on the continent as well.
Excellent. Follow up to that, is he still alive, Mo Ibrahim?
Oh, absolutely.
Oh, wow.
Absolutely. He is alive and he is doing wonderful things on the continent. One of the things that he does, which I think is really important, is they will give out an award of $5 million to a president or a leader on the African continent, usually a president who has done the most and the best in terms of really demonstrating the qualities of good governance and demonstrating governance that that impacts their people in a positive way. So I'm very supportive of that agenda. Some years they are able to give that award. Other years they haven't given it up because they don't feel that there's anybody who has met that standard. And so that's an important effort for all of us to support, I believe.
Another follow-up question to that. What country do you believe is really leading the charge to good governance and that other countries could model?
I don't think there's any one country. I think you have to look at the continent more broadly. When I go back to 1990, the state of democratic governance on the African continent was very poor. At that time, you had only 3 African countries that were characterized as democracies. Fast forward to 2017, you have more African countries that are firmly in that category of democratic states. You have others that are characterized as partly free, and then you have a few that still have a lot of work to do. So you look at that positive trajectory in terms of where the African continent came from. You had very few countries holding elections in 1990. Now they are routine, they are regular, they are occurring on a schedule, and there's actually transition of leadership where political parties lose the election and presidents lose the elections. Having said that, I think you saw a lot of that positive trajectory in the first 10 to 15 years after 1990. We're now seeing a little bit of backsliding. Up until 2016, for instance, you had 10 African presidents who had been in power for over 20 years. That's not a good thing because the longer you are in power, the more difficult it is to develop those institutions for good governance because power is so personalized. And so that's a challenge. We're seeing more and more African leaders trying to change the constitution so they can run for more than 2 terms. That's not a good thing. So this is why efforts like More Ibrahims and other efforts to really try and institutionalize democracy are really important. So you have countries that have been on that trajectory for a long time, the Botswanas of this world, and actually a few other countries across the continent that have maintained their democratic status. And so that isn't the only country, but we need to get more countries into that category.
Thank you. Speaking of which, let's go into the brain drain issue of African countries. So first, in case our audience doesn't know, describe what brain drain is and how Africa can leverage its power of Africans within the diaspora for its development.
Absolutely. Brain drain is a process by which usually educated Africans are leaving the continent in search of better opportunities outside of the continent of Africa. And this has been a huge, huge challenge for the continent. I meet many Africans even within the DC area, but it's the same thing when you go to other Western capitals. You go to Australia, you go to Canada, you go other places. You see a lot of educated Africans working and living outside of their countries. In fact, I think Pew did a study a few years ago, and the region that has the most educated people in Washington, D.C. is Africa. The population with the highest number of PhDs and master's degrees within the Washington area is Africa. That says a lot right there. So there are a number of things that I would point to with regard to that. There is the natural brain drain that will occur because people are looking for better opportunities for themselves and for their families. But I also think African governments need to have an honest look at themselves and some introspection about some of the issues to do with governance in their home countries that are causing these educated people, often educated at the expense of ordinary Africans, taxpayers, who are then leaving the country instead of staying at home to help develop their countries. And I think a lot of people would opt to stay at home, but for some of these governance issues. So I would implore African governments to look more closely at the environments that they have created through some of the governance decisions that they make that force those who are the most educated, who could probably have the biggest impact in terms of helping the continents, who are then forced to leave the country. I think that's one part of it. The second part of it is I think there are still governments on the African continent that tend to value the expertise that's brought to Africa by outsiders rather than the expertise that resides in their own people. We need to transform that thinking. We absolutely need to work on transforming that thinking. There are a lot of qualified Africans. And the fact that they can make a contribution when they go outside should tell you that they are qualified to perform in any context on any continent. So how do you value your own people, your own expertise, I think is one of those questions that we need to address and address more directly. And it absolutely pains me to some regard to see African governments paying this external foreign expertise 10, 15 times more than they would pay their own people. So I think that's another part that we need to address. The third part on the brain drain for me that's really important is also changing thinking around the issue of citizenship. The issue of citizenship is so contested in so many African countries that I think it has gotten in the way of potential contributions that those in the diaspora could make. And so, there are some African leaders who choose to see people who have left as traitors to their nation, and that, therefore we don't want to engage them, let them go where they have chosen to go. But I think it's a missed opportunity because I meet a lot of Africans in my travels here in Washington who want to contribute to their home countries. So how do you create an environment to engage the diaspora more in what's going on in their home countries? And there are a lot of them who are doing that on a personal level, a small-scale level. But I think working together and a different attitude towards those in the diaspora could enable us to amplify those efforts so they're more institutionalized and that they can really feed into development in the home countries. I mean, I talk to Africans who are, helping out their individual schools, paying school fees for a person, setting up a computer lab with others in their old school. So whatever it is, how do we make that a core part of, we recognize you, we recognize what you bring, you have a role here, you have a place here, instead of trying to exclude those in the diaspora, either because they're perceived as a political threat, or because governments truly don't understand the opportunities that the diaspora could bring in terms of helping with development and other things at home.
Now, you said citizenship. Is it when these people leave their country, they're no longer considered a citizen? They can't come back?
In many countries, they're not. I mean, if you in some countries, you're still a citizen. If you choose to take up citizenship of the country that you've gone to, then obviously you relinquish your citizenship. There's some countries that are looking at dual citizenship. There's some countries that are looking at all kinds of opportunities to pull in the diaspora into their development plans. There are countries like Ghana, for instance, where the diaspora actually, the Ghanaian diaspora, contributes more to the local economy than a lot of the exports that the country of Ghana actually has. And so there's potential there, and we're not really tapping into it as best we can. Mm-hmm. And so I would encourage African governments to really look into this issue, that, the diaspora is out there, wants to contribute, wants to help, still has very strong ties with their home countries in many cases. So how do we facilitate those ties, make them stronger and amplify them so they benefit the diaspora as well as the home countries?
Definitely. Now, with the study that you'd mentioned, you said that the highest educated Africans are populated in D.C. Mm-hmm. You fall into that category. So do you waffle personally with the brain drain issue, or do you consider yourself one of those Africans who are contributing back to their continent and there's no internal conflict at all?
That's a really good question, and it has taken me a long while to get to the answer that I'm going to give you. When I graduated in 1995, when I finished my PhD, I went back to Zambia because I wanted to work to contribute to the country. With my PhD in hand from the University of Oxford, I could not find a job in Zambia. And so I left Zambia and came here. My husband is American and came here. He had gotten a job in New Mexico. It wasn't where I wanted to be in the beginning. In fact, I had told my husband that a condition of marriage would be him living with me in Zambia. He got a job, I couldn't get a job. And so we ended up here. And it was really disappointing for me in the first place because I really felt like so much had been put into my receiving my education, and I now wanted to use that education to help benefit those who had given up so much so I could be educated, and then there were no opportunities for me. So it was upsetting for the longest time, but in many ways I'm grateful that it worked out that way. Yes. Why am I grateful? I'm grateful because not getting a job in Zambia has actually enabled me to have jobs that impact the entire African continent. Mm-hmm. So I go back to my job at the National Summit on Africa. The framework was looking at Africa broadly and engaging with Africa broadly, engaging with U.S.-Africa relations broadly across that continental framework. I go to my job at the Africa Center for Strategic Studies at the Department of Defense, where I was academic dean for about 13 years. Again, my job there encompassed the entire African continent. I come to my job here at the Wilson Center, again, the same opportunity to work on U.S.-Africa relations and to work on issues that impact Africa from a continental perspective. And so in that regard, I am very grateful. I didn't see it as a blessing then, but I do now that I've had this opportunity, because one door closed, another door opened that actually allowed me to have a much larger impact and influence on the issues that I care about so passionately. So there are ways you can contribute to Africa, whether you're sitting on the African continent in one country or you're sitting outside of the African continent. If your passion, if your interest, if your mission focuses on Africa, I think you can do it wherever you are and from whatever corner of responsibilities that you have, no matter how small they are. I always tell people that change begins with us as individuals. So make the change that you can from your corner of the world, from your corner of responsibilities. And when you bring it all together, the impact is just tremendous.
Beautiful. That was well put. I just lost my my next question. That was so good. Oh, there was a question. So broadening the term African diaspora to include African Americans, Afro-Latinos, how does their role fit into the benefiting of the continent?
Absolutely. When I talk about the African diaspora, I do talk about the diaspora in that context that you just described. And it's very important that we understand the interconnectedness. And whether you are of African descent on the islands in the Caribbean, in the United States, in Europe, in Australia, we are bonded by history. And so it is so important for us to remember that. I look at Africa, I look at Southern Africa in particular. Southern Africa and South Africa in particular would not have been able to end apartheid when it ended without the engagement of the African American diaspora, the African American community in this country. We should never forget that. This was a community that went all out and forced the administration to make some decisions at the policy level that enabled apartheid to be dismantled when it was dismantled. Without that engagement, that would not have happened when it happened. And so it's really important that we remember those interconnectedness. I also think that, and that's just one example. I mean, we could talk about a variety of examples. From my personal viewpoint, I think about, I would not be able to sit in the position in which I am standing in today or sitting in today without the sacrifices of those who've gone before me. Whether it was Africans in Africa or African Americans in this country or others more broadly. So it's remembering those on whose shoulders we stand and understanding that they may have African roots, but they are all over the world, and you have to support that agenda as we work together in figuring out what the role is. So the role is important, whether it's at the policy level, whether it's at the activism level, whether it's looking at how we teach Africa in our schools across the world, whether it's looking at how we engage with the next generation in terms of their place in the world. That is really important that we understand where we've come from, how we've worked together across borders as a diaspora to get to where we are, and then some of the challenges that we continue to face and how we need to work together on those challenges. And it's really important that we do that because sometimes I think there's a tendency to focus on that which makes us different, our differences, than the things that bring us together. And I think if we focus more on the things that bring us together, the things that define us as a people, it's easier to see where we need to continue to collaborate to work together. I have no doubt in my mind, and I say this to some of my African American friends here, that how people view Africa impacts how African Americans are viewed here. Mm-hmm. Whether people like to admit that or not, it's just the truth. Yes. So it's understanding those links, those connections, and how we begin to work together to break not just the stereotypes, but also to take advantage of the opportunities that would allow us to elevate the diaspora wherever it be.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. Wrapping up this interview, is there anything that you would like to share that you didn't get to share with our audience today?
I think one of the most important things for me is reinforcing the issue of always looking to what we can do individually and collectively on issues in the Africa space that we care about. I think that's one piece I would say. And often people say, I'm just one person, or, I don't have the authority to make the decisions that really matter. But one of the things that I've always looked at is no matter what your responsibilities are, no matter what your authorities are, you can make an impact from your corner of the world. I think the second part that I would say is we need to figure out how we raise and help to elevate the next generation. One of the issues that I have for me personally and a personal commitment is about remembering again those people who helped me to get where I got to, where I sit today, and then for me to now reach back and put my hand out and raise the next generation. And it becomes more important to me the more gray hairs I get, right? Because I'm going to be out of a job in another 5 to 10 years. This is a generation that's going to take over and sort of shape our future and where we go. So how do you help them get to a position where they can take on those responsibilities and that mission? But I'm also cognizant of the fact that how I perform in my job can either shut doors for others or open doors for others. And so that's a big responsibility and something that I think about often in terms of always trying to do the best that I can in whatever position that I'm in, so that my legacy would be one of opening doors for others and not necessarily and not shutting doors. And so do the best that you can, stay focused, and figure out how we elevate the next generation.
Yes. Thank you so much. So if somebody would like to get in contact with you or the center, how would they be able to do so?
Absolutely. We would welcome you. Our mission here at the Wilson Center for the Africa Program is threefold. We work on trying to educate Americans about Africa, trying to develop mutually beneficial relations between the United States and Africa, and trying to develop some policy recommendations that can help transform some of the key issues that Africa is struggling with and some of the key issues in U.S.-Africa relations. We encourage you to get involved, and if you would like to reach out, please visit our website, wilsoncenter.org. Go to the Africa program, and our contact information will be on that page.
Thank you, Doctor.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Cut.